Graham said, if you didn't catch the NFT panel earlier, my name is Liddell. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester, and since sort of September 2018, I've been working on a collaborative PhD project with the National Museums of Liverpool, basically looking at how we might implement blockchain and most specifically NFTs within museum practices, and looking at it kind of how we can connect audiences and communities through this idea of digital thingness. So I'm going to go into a bit more details about what this project involved than I did earlier. But of course, just as a way of introduction, of course, 2021 has been certainly the year of the NFT. We've seen such a massive surge of interest, which has been pretty exciting for myself. You know, I've been kind of spending most of my life trying to get people engaged in NFTs. And now I don't have to, which is great. But yeah, as we can see, we've had musicians get on board. We've even had Paris Hilton get engaged with them. But you know, what's so great about them, and why should we care about them in this space? And hopefully I can present a few ideas to you today. So yes, in terms of my research, I look at it very much from the concept of, can the NFT add anything to kind of co-productive work in museums? And I think about this through the idea of shared authority, which I derive from the work of people like Frisch and Phillips, who both use the term to essentially reflect on the role of audience members and participants in the meaning-making process and collaboration with cultural institutions. So when I talk about shared authority, I'm thinking about this idea of collaboration and contribution from voices that are perhaps more traditionally outside of the traditional institution, and thinking, how does the NFT add to all of this? But first of all, I'm sure some of you might be thinking, well, what does an NFT stand for? Well, an NFT is a non-fungible token. It's a type of token stored on a blockchain, and a blockchain is a type of distributed ledger technology, or what we call a DLT. So what that means is basically, think of it like a massive database distributed across a network of computers. And this database stores information about every transaction that takes place in that network. So for example, if person A sends one coin to person B, the information about this exchange is then documented into the various copies of that database stored across that network. So this means that blockchain is not centralized, so there's no singular point of failure. And instead, it tends to be more decentralized or distributed in nature, because agency is essentially shared across a network of nodes rather than being centrally stored. So this basically allows us to use this database as a form of provenance of any token stored in the network, thus enabling us basically to use blockchain to kind of claim ownership over something and prove its authenticity. And so when we think about blockchain, though, you might have straight away thought about cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, because this was the first major use case of the technology. But in fact, as we can start to see now, there's far more kind of ways we can use blockchain than it just being a digital money infrastructure. And this basically derives from the type of tokens that we store in it. So there's two types. Firstly, there's fungible tokens. So these are tokens that are divisible with one another, such as a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. But to give you an example, a pound coin is another example of a fungible token, because if we exchange pound coins with each other, we haven't lost any value, we simply exchange things. Non-fungible tokens, on the other hand, are kind of different because we can store unique assets with them. So we can basically use it to store things such as artwork and artifacts. Now, when it actually comes to storing these things online, I should kind of mention that we don't actually store the file onto a blockchain. So instead, we use a link to direct us to a file stored elsewhere. And we can do this in two ways. So either we use something called an interplanetary file system, or IPFS, which is like a decentralized or peer-to-peer storage system, or we simply use a URL link, which is what we did in my project. So essentially, you take the URL link of the image stored on the museum website, and you attach this to the token. But in essence, blockchain gives us a way to identify tokens in the online space. And in doing so, this is said to create digital thingness in digital content, because we can essentially now distinguish and exchange content online that was essentially very previously difficult to own or commodify. So just in case, kind of in terms of kind of use cases, first use cases that we saw of NFTs tended to just focus on this idea of being a trading card or kind of basically trading memes and collectibles. But in 2014, we saw the kind of first, what we might call art NFT, which was developed by Kevin McCoy and Emil Dash back at Rhizome 707 conference in 2014. And basically they came together to develop this thing called Monograph, which basically tries to be a kind of authentication management system by storing digital content or a link to digital content onto a blockchain. But since then, so many people have kind of taken that idea and developed just such a diverse set of companies from it. So we've got things like decentralized galleries now, which are kind of curated, decentralized spaces such as Known Origin. We have more kind of authentication management systems such as Uncopied, which we heard from Eliane earlier today. And we've got things like exchanges such as OpenSea, which, think of it as kind of a blockchain version to Etsy. And then we've also got things like metaverses, companies trying to do fractional ownership. And of course, now this year, we're starting to see museums use it within fundraising and digital income sources as well. But I'm really thinking, what else can we do with this digital thingness beyond the monetary? So in terms of my work, I look at how we can use NFTs within community engagement practices, and specifically ask, can the NFT be used to forge new connections between a museum and the audience it serves, and essentially then use the NFT outside of this monetary focus, and instead be used to inform new values that relate closely to the work of the museum. So the main body of research, as I mentioned earlier today, basically focuses around the co-creation of an online exhibition called Crypto Connections. But it's also just to note that I will be drawing on some other research I did within this project, which was basically interviews with colleagues at the NML as well. But essentially this online exhibition, we brought together a group of participants to a workshop in January 2020, and we asked them to choose one personal possession that they own based on their kind of personal relationship to it. And we also invited them to choose one museum object from the NML collection, again, based on this idea of personal relationships. And these two types of objects form the basis of Crypto Connections. And in the right-hand corner there, you can see basically one example from this exhibition. So there's the image of the object, and then next to it is a summary, which is written by the participant, basically explaining why they chose it and what their personal relationship is to it. From this, we then basically use this information to create personal NFTs or personal editions. And we did this using a possession gallery or a decentralized gallery that was specially devised for the project, which is essentially connected to the Ethereum blockchain via a thing called a smart contract, which is basically how we mint NFTs. And I'll go into a little more detail about exactly how this works in a minute. But essentially, we made an NFT of each object in the collection, and each participant now owns a token that represents the objects that they chose for Crypto Connections. And then we had a kind of second workshop as well, where they kind of were offered the opportunity to reflect on this idea of having something to own. So just in terms of the actual possession gallery, just to give you an idea of the process of what we call minting. So on the screenshot of the possession gallery admin page you see here, basically you just need 4 kind of key aspects of information that we took from the online exhibition. So you've got the title, you have the image URL link, which I mentioned earlier, just basically takes from the website, and the description, which is the participants' kind of personal narrative that they wrote for the exhibition, and then the owner address, so who's going to own it. And we asked the participants to basically set up a digital wallet. So once you click submit, this gets sent and added to the blockchain, and you get something which looks a little bit like the thing on the right here. This is quite a low quality example of it because I just had to take this as a screenshot from the possession gallery. But each participant owns their token in their digital wallet, and the possession gallery just simply kind of is a way to display all these places in a kind of temporary digital space. So to give you, so that's just a quick kind of summary of what I've been doing with the NML. But in terms of thinking about, how we kind of, what we were trying to find from all of this, we were kind of thinking about this idea of how can it connect audiences to cultural institutions, but also bring this idea of a personal element to interpretation and understanding around cultural objects. And so in thinking about this idea of shared authority, there are just a couple of points I want to raise. So firstly, the token represents the participant's personal interpretation of the object, rather than a typical information you might see in the physical gallery. So this obviously challenges the idea of kind of traditional curatorial authority, because we've now prioritized the participant's experience over the traditional narrative. So this essentially produces a shared authority approach, because curatorial authority is shared with the participant. And this, of course, kind of builds on ideas around the polysemic objects and the idea of the post-museum, where kind of the call is kind of to realign the focus of an institution with the experience of the viewer, rather than being kind of more object focused. So that knowledge is essentially unified and monolithic, and it becomes fragmented and multivocal. At the same time, however, the use of tokens to embody these personal narratives means that the physical gallery remains the same. So in other words, basically the process hasn't actually changed the NML and how they present the objects. Rather, it simply just creates a digital extension that represents different voices. And this really relates to what Morse writes about the inherent problem of contributory projects, because they tend not to actually make any inherent changes to the cultural institution. In the same way, the token has not really made any inherent change to the NML itself. It's simply just a thing which the museum no longer owns or has control over. However, this personal experience connected to the token also means that the NFT gains a special quality, because it also becomes a symbol of the participant's work and investment in the project itself. And this is a really important point, I think, and something that actually got picked up on during my interviews with the museum colleagues. For example, Participant 6, he was actually referring to a project that they had carried out with the NML separately. It's really important when engaging with people that they get something back from it. And part of that is just telling their story and knowing that it was captured by the museum. But part of that is having this thing to take away. So translating this into the project, the process of impersonal interpretation becomes a way of embodying the participant's experience and involvement in the project. It is, in fact, a way of remunerating the participant for their work. And importantly, this then provides the token with meaning and value that is not necessarily monetary in nature. On the other hand, the participant control is also a factor in challenging institutional authority, because in this project, the participant has complete control over the token. So they could, for example, sell their token if they wanted to, and the museum literally has no way of stopping them. In turn, this means that the museum basically must engage what we see as radical trust, which has been discussed in literature previously around kind of shared authority and co-productive projects. Because for example, Chan et al. Use it in terms of kind of museum blogs and talks about how museums basically must radically trust the community surrounding these blogs. Likewise, Lynch and Alberti use the term in relation to kind of collaborative practices, where the museum again must radically trust the participants in both the process and the output of the project. Likewise, the NML needs to essentially completely trust these participants, so ensure that they just won't make, for example, speculative markets around these tokens and sell them at high prices. In this respect, it enforces an idea of shared authority because the museum has relinquished some of its control over the token to the participant. Now, I say this is shared authority in this case because I've argued that it's unlikely that the participants would actually choose to sell their tokens for two core reasons. Firstly, because of the personal nature attached to the token, but secondly, because it's embedded in connections with the museum because the object obviously resides still in the NML. And indeed, in the second workshop in July 2020, it was noted about this kind of uncertainty about whether the token really belonged to the participant or still had these connections to the museum, despite the fact that obviously the technology clearly declares the participant as the owner of the token. Therefore, there are kind of obstructions to the participant's ability to sell the token, which materializes in the sense of the museum still having claims of ownership over the NFT and what it represents. Moreover, and building on this, there is kind of a structural problem to the way we've made the NFTs because we've used an image URL link connected to the NML website. In other words, the image needed to visualize the NFT is still centrally stored on the museum website rather than it being distributed stored in something like an IPFS system. And this means that the museum is essentially not losing anything apart from the digital extension of the original digital object. And this is embodied in the following comment, again from the museum interviews I carried out. In terms of the museum isn't losing anything they need in order for the museum to actually carry out its aims. But then this also raises important questions around utility value, as the comment from part of me noted in the second workshop highlights. I think part of me is wondering about utility as well. Like, is this something I can use in the future for a kind of asset? Or is this something more along the lines of, I don't know, a Pokemon card that I can collect and add to others? In this case, the utility value could be essentially just a way of storing value, such as using it as an asset. But there's also a point here that it's not necessarily about making money. It could be a way, for example, of trading with others and learning about how they experience objects, or it could be just a way of making a personal digital collection that actually has real exchange value. Therefore, the discussion on utility value also starts to reevaluate the meaning of behind the token. For example, can the token simply be a way of remunerating shared authority or collaborative processes and projects, or does there need to be something more to this? So as a way of kind of drawing some initial conclusions, what we see here is this project attempts to create a shared authority approach through the idea of personal narrative and the ability to control the token. At the same time, the ability to control the token and embed narrative into the NFT doesn't actually impact the physical museum or the original physical objects. Instead, what we see here is that token becomes simply a way of remunerating participants for their work in the project. And of course, this has a certain risk to it because, of course, the token could be, well, a form of tokenism. And in thinking about this risk and how to address it, I think the answer really lies in the utility value of the token itself. So in other words, what else can the participant do with their token beyond simply selling it? Therefore, I feel like the token needs to be more than a way of embodying personal experience, and instead embody some form of agency as well. And in my thesis, I'm trying to develop this idea of what a blockchain approach might look like. And as I said at the start, a blockchain is a decentralized and distributed technology, which basically means that agency is distributed across a network of computers rather than a centralized system. And so if we take that as a framework, I'm wondering whether this could actually just be a useful way of rethinking governance structures and the power in decision-making in museums. And indeed, think about whether the NFT could be a way of enforcing distributed agency in what has traditionally been a very centralized institution. Thank you very much for listening.